Lydia Monroe was 41 years old when her husband of 8 years looked across the kitchen table on a Sunday morning and told her, in the calm and certain voice he used for things he had already decided, that he believed he could find better. He said it plainly. He did not raise his voice. He did not appear angry. He appeared resolved, the way a man appeared when he had rehearsed a conversation long enough that the rehearsal had become the thing itself, and the words had stopped carrying weight because he had worn them smooth. She was drinking coffee. She had made it herself. In the kitchen she had redesigned around a large east-facing window, so the morning light came in at the angle she wanted. Across the counters she had chosen, and the floor she had sealed herself on a long weekend in late October. She looked at him for a moment without speaking. Then she set her mug down. She did not ask what he meant. She understood what he meant. She had been understanding it. In the gradual and quiet way she understood most things for approximately 2 years before he said it out loud. What her husband Terence did not know, what he had not thought to calculate in 8 years of marriage, was that Lydia Monroe had been building something entirely apart from him since before he had the capacity to recognize it for what it was. The landscape architecture firm she had incorporated quietly in her 3rd year of marriage had generated $1 million in revenue the year before he left. He had never once asked to see her books. He spent the following 26 months looking for better. He did not find it. She spent those same 26 months finishing what she had started. By the time they saw each other again, she was wearing a ring that a man named Solomon had placed on her hand the previous April on the back porch of the house she now owned alone. On a quiet evening, when the garden she had planted was in full bloom, and the light was the kind of light she had spent her entire professional life learning how to place correctly. Terence saw the ring at a mutual friend's gathering on a Saturday evening in October. He saw the man beside her. He saw what 2 years had made of her, and he was still alone. And the expression on his face when he understood the full accounting of his miscalculation was something she registered once and did not return to. What happened next was simply the truth of a thing arriving on schedule. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The morning he left, she finished her coffee. She had learned that from her father, a man named Edgar Monroe, who had worked for 30 years as a finishing carpenter in Richmond, Virginia. A man of few words and considerable patience, who had taught her by example that the quality of your attention to small things was the most accurate measure of your character. He had a saying he repeated only when it mattered: a garden does not grow faster because you want it to. You prepare the ground. You plant correctly. You wait. He had died 4 years before Terence said what he said at the kitchen table, gone in the way that good men sometimes went, quietly and without sufficient warning. And Lydia had been at his bedside in the afternoon and had held his hand and had told him what she was building, the firm she had just incorporated, the first 2 clients she had signed. And he had squeezed her hand once and looked at her the way he looked at finished work that had come out right. She had carried that look with her since. She carried it particularly on mornings when she needed to remember what she was made of. She had met Terence at a professional development event in Richmond 11 years before the Sunday morning at the kitchen table. He was an account manager at a marketing firm, well-spoken and organized. The kind of man who arrived on time and remembered your preferences and made you feel, in the early months, that you had been seen with a specificity that was unusual. She had appreciated that. She had been working very hard in those years, building the technical side of her practice, licensing in landscape architecture, taking on contract work that paid modestly but built her portfolio. And she had been grateful for a man who came home and asked specific questions about her day, rather than general ones. The marriage had been good in the first years and complicated in the middle years, and clearly wrong by the time the last 2 years arrived, though it had taken her until he said what he said to allow herself to name it. He had grown critical in a way that was difficult to locate because it was rarely specific. He did not say you are bad at your work. He said things like, I just wonder if you've really thought through the growth side of this, or I'm not sure this is the right market for what you're trying to do, in a tone that invited her to agree with him. He said these things about her business in the evenings after she had spent 12 hours building it, and she had received his doubt in the way she received most things from him, with patience, and had gone back to work the next morning without it. The firm's name was Monroe Groundworks, and it was 4 years old when he left, and it designed residential and commercial landscape systems in the Mid-Atlantic corridor, with a focus on native plantings and drainage infrastructure. Work that was both beautiful and functional, which was the only kind of work Lydia had ever been interested in doing. She had 3 full-time employees, 2 subcontracting crews, and a client list that had grown entirely through referral. She had never advertised. She had never needed to. He did not know the revenue figure. He did not know the client list. He did not know that the account she maintained in her name alone, the one she had opened the year she incorporated, held considerably more than anything visible from where he stood. She had not hidden any of this from him. She had simply never been asked. The morning he said what he said, she finished her coffee, rinsed the mug, and went to her desk in the second bedroom she used as an office. She closed the door. She opened her project files and worked for 4 hours. She was in the middle of a commercial design proposal for a mixed-use development in Northern Virginia, and the deadline was Thursday, and the work did not pause for anything, which was one of the things she had always loved about it. He moved out 12 days later. The process was quiet and without drama, which she had expected from a man who rehearsed his conversations. He took what was his. He left what was hers. The house was hers, which he had not contested, perhaps because the mortgage was in her name and had been from the beginning, because she had been the one whose credit and income the lender had qualified. He had signed the paperwork the way he signed most paperwork, with the assumption that the architecture around him had been built by someone else on his behalf. She stood in the kitchen the evening he left and looked at the east-facing window she had repositioned to catch the morning light at the angle she wanted. And she thought about the 8 years that had passed in that kitchen, and what they had produced, and what they had cost. She was, by professional training, a person who thought in terms of systems. A system that consumed more than it produced was a system that needed to be redesigned. She had understood that for some time. She simply had not been willing to name it while she was inside it. She did not cry until the 2nd week. And when she did, it was not for the marriage she had lost, but for the version of herself she had allowed to shrink inside it, quietly, over 8 years, accommodating his doubt in the particular way she had been trained by his doubt to accommodate it. She cried for that woman, for the contracts she had declined because his questions had made her uncertain, for the practice area she had held back on because he had said the market wasn't right, for the 3 years she had kept Monroe Groundworks deliberately small because she had internalized his ceilings as her own. She cried with the specificity of someone itemizing a loss. And then she was done. She took out a legal pad and wrote down every professional decision she had made in the last 4 years that she could trace back to his doubt, rather than her own judgment. She did not do this in anger. She did it the way she documented a site assessment, methodically, without editorial, because she needed to understand the full scope of what she was correcting before she could correct it. There were 9 decisions on the list. She looked at them for a long time. Then she folded the paper and put it in the bottom drawer of her desk, not to revisit, but because a woman who kept good records should keep all of them. She called her closest friend, A woman named Adele, who had known her since the first year of graduate school, and who had never fully trusted Terence on the grounds that a man who offered opinions about your work he did not understand was always a man worth watching carefully. Lydia had not always agreed with that assessment while she was inside the marriage. She agreed with it now. She told Adele what had happened. She told her about the Sunday morning and the coffee and the 9 decisions on the list. Adele listened to all of it without interrupting, which was the thing Lydia had always most valued about her. The ability to hear a thing completely before she responded to it. Adele said 2 things. The first was that she was sorry. Not sorry about the marriage, but sorry about the cost of it, which was the more precise sympathy and the one Lydia needed. The second was that she needed Lydia to hear her clearly when she said that what was ahead of her was going to be extraordinary. Lydia had believed her, not because she needed the reassurance, but because the numbers in her business account told a version of the same story, and numbers did not require reassurance. They only required reading. She hired a 4th employee that spring, a young woman named Priya who had a graduate degree in ecological design and who had applied 3 times before Lydia had a position to offer her. Lydia had kept Priya's application in a folder she reviewed twice a year. Not because she had forgotten it, but because she had not been ready, and because she had spent 2 years absorbing someone else's opinion of her readiness and had confused that absorption for caution. She called Priya on a Thursday morning in April. Priya said yes before the offer was fully stated. She expanded Monroe Groundworks into commercial public space design the same month, a practice area she had been studying for 3 years, attending symposiums and reading the technical literature and building relationships with civil engineers who worked on public infrastructure. Doing the preparation without the execution, because his questions had made the execution feel premature. It was not premature. It had never been premature. She understood that now in the particular way that required no further discussion. The first public space contract came in May of her first year after the divorce, a Parks Department commission in Richmond worth $180,000, the largest single project the firm had taken on. The commission had come through a contact she had built at one of those symposiums 2 years prior, a contact she had maintained with the same steady consistency she maintained all professional relationships, because she was a woman who understood that the ground you prepared years in advance was the ground that supported the weight when it arrived. She designed the park herself, working from the same principles her father had used when he finished a piece of wood, which was to follow the grain of the material rather than fight it, to let the thing tell you what it wanted to become. She worked long hours and did not find them long. She brought Priya in on the drainage infrastructure, and the 2 of them worked through the specifications over several evenings at Lydia's kitchen table, the same table at which Terence had sat and said what he said, which had lost none of its utility as a table and gained something in the process of being reclaimed for better use. The park opened 14 months later to a ribbon cutting attended by city council members and the Parks Department director, and a reporter from the Richmond Times who had written a feature on the landscape architect behind the design. The photograph showed Lydia standing at the edge of the water feature she had specified and built to direct the seasonal runoff in a pattern that was both functional and beautiful. In her work clothes, her hair natural and unpinned, looking at the camera the way a woman looked when she was standing in something she had built and knew it was sound. It was the most honest photograph anyone had ever taken of her. Her uncle Bernard, her father's younger brother, and the man who had walked her down the aisle 8 years earlier because her father was already gone, and Bernard was what was left of her father in the world, saw the photograph in the paper before Lydia could call him about it. He called her that morning, his voice carrying the particular compression of a man who did not perform feeling but could not entirely contain it, and he said the only thing that needed to be said. He said, "Edgar would have put this on his wall." She had to set the phone down for a moment. She went back to her desk and looked at her 5-year projections and updated them, because the actual numbers from the first year after the divorce had come in ahead of the plan, and a plan that did not reflect the actual was not a plan she could use. The firm had closed the year at $4 million in revenue. She had projected $1 million. The difference was Priya and the Parks Commission and 2 commercial clients who had found her through the Times feature. And she documented each source on the projection update because she was a woman who tracked where things came from. She had been on 3 dates in the first year after the divorce. 2 had been pleasant, and 1 had been interesting, but none of them had become anything she wanted to continue, which she accepted without distress. She was not managing a vacancy. She was building something. The 2 states were not incompatible, but the building required the larger share of her attention, and she gave it willingly. Solomon had come into her life in the 18th month through the Parks Commission project, which he had worked on as a civil engineer for the city. He was a deliberate man with a specific kind of intelligence, the kind that operated through questions rather than declarations, who had asked her 3 weeks into the acquaintance what her design philosophy was, and had then listened to the full answer without redirection. He had called the design beautiful when he saw the completed park, and when she thanked him, he said he did not mean it as a compliment in the ordinary sense. He meant it as an accurate description, which was a distinction she understood and respected. He took her to dinner 6 weeks after that. He asked more questions. He did not offer opinions about her work that he was not qualified to offer, which was the kind of thing she noticed now in a way she had not always noticed. She introduced him to Adele at 5 months. She introduced him to her uncle Bernard at 7 months. Bernard took him to the backyard and asked about his work, and then asked about his intentions, directly in the way that Bernard asked everything, and came back inside and looked at Lydia and said, "I like him." He held that back for 11 seconds before he said it, which from Bernard was the equivalent of a lengthy endorsement. Solomon proposed on the back porch of her house on an evening in April, when the garden she had planted in the first spring after Terence left was in full bloom. The peonies she had planned, and the native grasses she had specified from her own inventory, and the Japanese maple she had planted for her father the first year she owned the house outright. He asked with a ring he had chosen himself, a simple thing in yellow gold that was exactly right without being a performance. She said yes before he had finished the sentence. The mutual friends gathering was in October of the following year, which was 26 months after the Sunday morning at the kitchen table. The hosts were a couple named the Washingtons, who had known both Lydia and Terence separately for years, and who had navigated the divorce the way good people navigated their friends' divorces, with care and without choosing sides, continuing to invite both of them to things and trusting that adults could manage the geography of a room. Lydia had always respected them for that. She arrived with Solomon. She was wearing a dress she had bought for the occasion, a deep green that her friend Adele had said was the right choice with the ring. She was not thinking about Terence when she arrived. She was thinking about the drainage commission she and Solomon had discussed on the drive over, a technical problem she had been turning in the back of her mind for 3 days, and Solomon had asked a question in the car that had opened a direction she had not considered. And she was following that direction as she walked through the Washingtons' front door, because her mind did not stop for parties. The room was warm and full of people she knew. She spoke to a colleague from her early contracting years. She spoke to Bernard's friend Raymond, who was 80 years old and still shook hands like a man who had worked with his hands his whole life. She ate something and drank 1 glass of wine, and kept Solomon beside her in the easy way of people who did not need to perform closeness, because it was already present. She saw Terence across the room approximately 40 minutes after she arrived. He saw her at the same moment, which she could tell, because the recognition changed his posture in a way she recognized from 8 years of watching him compute information he had not prepared for. She took in what was visible without effort. He was alone. He was dressed well, which had always been his habit. But something in the fit of the evening did not settle on him correctly. The way a finished room looked slightly off when the proportions were right, but the occupant was wrong for it. She could not have said what exactly produced that impression. She had spent her career reading the relationship between a space and what it was asked to hold. She recognized a mismatch. He walked over after 20 minutes. The walk itself was composed and unhurried, which was the way he managed things that cost him something. He said hello to them both. He said Lydia looked well. He shook Solomon's hand with the grip of a man who was deciding something about the hand he was shaking. Solomon shook back and said it was good to meet him, and looked at him with the complete, comfortable attention of a man who had nothing to prove in this or any other room, and was simply gathering information that might or might not be interesting. Terence looked at the ring. It was not a subtle look. He looked at it the way a person looked at an accounting that did not match their projection, finding the column that had gone unexpectedly long. He said, "I heard things were going well for you." She said, "They are." She said it the way her father stated the quality of finished work. Without weight, without performance, without any particular need for him to believe it more than the evidence already required him to. The way a number read itself when the column was complete. He said he had seen the piece in the Times. He said the park looked beautiful. She said, "Thank you." She said Priya had done exceptional work on the drainage infrastructure, and she made sure to note that, because credit should land where it belonged. He said something else then, something she did not fully hear, because Solomon had touched her elbow lightly at that moment to indicate that the Washingtons were trying to gather people toward the back porch, and her attention moved naturally in that direction. She looked back at Terence and said it was good to see him, and meant it in the way she meant most things, precisely and without remainder. She turned. She did not look back. The drive home was easy. Solomon asked the question about the drainage problem again, from a different angle, and she talked through the solution she had been developing for the past 40 minutes, and by the time they pulled into her driveway, she had the framework of it. She wrote 4 notes on the legal pad she kept in her bag before they went inside. Solomon made tea. The evening continued. She had thought about it once more before she slept that night. Not about Terence, about the accounting of it, about what 2 years had produced on each side of that Sunday morning, about what a person's doubt cost them when they applied it to the wrong person. Her father had always said the garden did not grow faster because you wanted it to, but he had also said something else, something she had not remembered until this particular night. Lying in the quiet of a house that was entirely her own. He had said that the plants that struggled in poor ground, the ones that survived drought and thin soil, and seasons that offered nothing easy, those were the ones whose root systems went deepest, and whose canopy spread farthest when conditions finally turned. He said that was not an accident. He said that was the design. She had thought about that for a long time before she slept. She had built something true. It had taken longer than it would have without the weight, but it was sounder for having been built under resistance. The way wood that had grown slowly through difficult seasons was always denser and harder and longer lasting than wood that had grown fast and easy in ideal conditions. Her father had told her that too, and like everything he had told her, she had not fully understood it until she needed it. She was free. She was building. She was loved by a man who asked the right questions and waited for the full answer. Some things, she thought, were exactly worth the years they required. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.